Good morning, all of you. This is time that we discuss Noam Chomsky. Abraham Noam Chomsky. He is a living American linguist, philosopher, social critic, and political activist. He is now 92 years old, and he has been considered as one of the leading linguists and Marxist thinker. And he is described as the father of modern linguistics. And his major contributions in the field of linguistics is his theories like Transformational Grammar or Transformational Generative Grammar, TGG. And very interestingly, Noam Chomsky took his PhD also in the area of Transformational Generative Grammar. And it was a very novel idea proposed by him through his book called Syntactic Structures. UGC also asked this question. The book Syntactic Structures was written by whom? It was Noam Chomsky who produced his book Syntactic Structures. After completing his PhD, he developed the idea of the TGG and produced it in his book called Syntactic Structures. And it is the study of linguistics that considers grammar to be adaptable. Formerly, grammar was not at all adaptable, and grammar quite often seemed incoherent to the rules. Chomsky wanted grammar to be adaptable to produce new sentences from the existing ones. The old grammarians insisted that the sentences must be kept as a single whole and not to be made into different sentences, not to be made into auxiliary sentences, to be kept as the sentence in the same way that it is produced. And Chomsky actually made this theory to be more adaptable by producing more sentences out from the existing ones. And very interestingly, the study of linguistics is explained by his assistant, Selig Harris. Selig Harris actually started as a Bloomfieldian. And Bloomfield was there, and Selig Harris actually started as a Bloomfieldian. And Bloomfield introduced the IC analysis, immediate constituency analysis. And Selig Harris, being a Bloomfieldian, continued in the IC analysis pattern of discussing the grammatical sentences. But with the coming of Chomsky and with the introduction of the TGG grammar, Selig Harris became an assistant to Noam Chomsky. And in the words of Selig Harris, the TGG can be explained through an example. And the sentence is, I finally met this talk show host. You always detest it. That this is one sentence. I finally met this talk show host. You always detest it. So the first sentence, the first part of the sentence, not the first sentence, which is produced as a single sentence, and it is a complex sentence, because in the sentence we come to find the conjunction that is used, the relative pronoun that is used. I finally met the talk show host. You always detest it. Whom you always detested. Always you detested this talk show host, but I finally met him. and the single sentence can be made into two sentences. I finally met the talk show host can be made as one sentence. And the next sentence, you always detested this talk show host. Whom you detested, whom you always detested is made into you always detested this talk show host. So sentences can be made into various independent sentences. From one sentence, through the transformational generative pattern, many sentences can be made, and the speaker is flexible in choosing his alternate ways. He can choose the best way suited to him. There should be no final verdict on the question that the sentence should be produced as a single whole. It can be developed into two sentences, can be made into three sentences, and this is according to the interest of the speaker. And this way of changing the sentences was made possible through the transformational generative grammar made by Chomsky. And it is the study of linguistics that considers grammar to be adaptable to produce new sentences. And I told you, Selig Harris, the assistant of Noam Chomsky, provides an example where transformation is affected. And the example given by Selig Harris is, I finally met this talk show host. You always detested. And this can be made into two sentences. I finally met the talk show host. And the next sentence is, you always detested this talk show host. And the thing is very clear. The subject, the talk show host, is again produced there to make the thing more clear. And this is the way of producing sentences through the transformational generative grammar pattern. And Chomsky came out with other modern theories also, like deep structure and surface structure. And it was in his book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. It was produced in the year 1965. He speaks about these two levels of language, deep structure and surface structure. And that was also asked by UGC once. Deep structure and surface structure are theories produced by whom? It was Noam Chomsky who introduced the theory of deep structure and surface structure. And deep structure is actually connected with the semantic form, and surface structure is related to its phonological form. Surface is phonological, how the sentence is produced, and deep is connected with the semantic, the creation of the sentence, the meaning that is contained in the sentence, or the creation. It is called the deep. And the surface, the peripheral one, that is the spoken area, and it is called the phonological form, and it is the surface structure, deep structure and surface structure. And it was Chomsky who introduced the theory of minimalism. And in introducing the theory of minimalism, and it was done as a research by him, he goes above the deep surface structure pattern and again went above the deep structure pattern, deep and surface structure pattern, to the idea of LF and PF. LF is actually the logical form and PF is phonetic form. Deep structure and surface structure are extended to PF form and LF form. Deep structure extended to LF form, logical form. And surface structure is extended to the phonetic form, that is called PF form, phonetic form. So it was Noam Chomsky who introduced the ideas of deep structure and surface structure. So in sentences we come to find the deep structure and surface structure. Deep structure is actually connected with the semantic part of the sentence. So the meaning and the making of the sentence. And surface, it is peripheral and it is connected with the phonetic form. Deep structure connected with semantic and surface connected with phonetic. And later he introduced his research on minimalism and expanded the idea of deep structure and surface structure into logical form and phonetic form. Logical form is LF and phonetic form is PF. And it was in 1986 Chomsky proposed a distinction between I language and E language. And again he continued his studies and presented the difference between I language and E language, internal language and the external language. In I language, in internal language, a speaker is able to create and understand complex patterns. In I language, the speaker is able to create and understand even complex sentences. And it is his competence. And it was Chomsky who introduced the idea of competence and performance. An extension of his theories. He introduced deep structure and surface structure, extended it into LF and PF, logical form and phonetic form, and then went to make a distinction between I language and E language, internal language and external language. And in I language, so the speaker is able to create and understand complex patterns. It shows his competency. He may be capable to use various type of usages in his sentences if he has got time. And he is competent to create complex sentences. But in E language, he won't be able to use the learned complex sentences and his performance will not equal with his competence. So he may be able to speak complex sentences and write complex patterns also, will be able to create and understand complex patterns and produce complex sentences. But in actual performance, he will not be able to do such things. So the performance and the competence is different. And the difference between competence and performance can be put as the difference between I language and E language. And Chomsky was the one who introduced the phrase structure grammar. It is also called PS grammar. And they are also known as constituency grammar. And that is against the dependency grammar. PS grammar is introduced by Noam Chomsky as constituency grammar, not dependency. And the constituency relation derives from subject-predicate division. Actually, the constituency relationship is the relationship between the subject and predicate. And that is common in the Latin and Greek grammars. And Chomsky is not discarding the Greek and Latin grammar rules. So he comes to find the Latin and grammar rules and makes it more adaptable for the people to follow. And actually constituency grammar is a part of the old grammar, a part of the Greek and early Latin grammar. And the dependency relation is actually the one-to-one relationship that is developed by the new grammarians. For example, in a sentence like Luke laughed or Harish drank or Rajesh wrote, in such a sentence, Harish is the noun and wrote is the verb. And we can divide it in the noun phrase and verb phrase. Mr. Harish wrote. Mr. Harish who works as a doctor, wrote a prescription. Mr. Harish, who works as a doctor in a hospital, it is the noun phrase. Then the verb phrase is wrote a prescription for a patient. And these two constitute the sentence. The noun phrase and verb phrase constitute the sentence. It's actually the idea presented by the modern grammarians, and this is the dependency grammar. The subject and the verb clause are mutually dependent. And in constituency grammar, therefore in such sentences, we divide the sentence as two nodes. One is the subject node and the other is the verb node. The noun phrase and verb phrase, NP and VP, one-to-one relation is the dependency grammar. But in constituency grammar or in phrase structure grammar, there are three nodes. And the modern grammarians say that there are only two nodes, the noun phrase and the verb phrase. But Chomsky, basing the Latin and Old Greek grammar, maintained the idea that there are three nodes. Not only the noun phrase and verb phrase, the entirety of the sentence is also to be taken into consideration. So there is the noun phrase, there is also the verb phrase. But the entirety of the sentence, the totality of the sentence, the wholeness of the sentence is also to be taken into consideration, and it is to be called the SP, the sentence phrase. And otherwise it will be an one-to-one correspondence only. So otherwise the sentence will be an one-to-one correspondence, the dependency pattern alone. It should be made into a constituency pattern. The one-to-one relationship, what is called the dependency grammar, is to be discarded with. And when a sentence is to be divided, we have to divide it as three nodes. The subject phrase or the noun phrase, then the verb phrase, and after all, the whole of the sentence is to be considered as the sentence phrase. And these three nodes to be considered when we analyze a sentence. And this theory of Noam Chomsky is called the phrase structure grammar. And it has got relation with the Old Latin and Greek grammar. And we remember that it was Noam Chomsky who came out with the idea of TGG, Transformational Generative Grammar. And he produced his book Syntactic Structures and introduced the idea of the TGG, Transformational Generative Grammar. And a little later he came out with the idea of the deep structure and surface structure, and it was introduced by him in his book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. And deep structure, I told you, semantic form, and surface actually the phonetic form. And he introduced his research on minimalism and presented the idea of the deep structure and surface structure. And then he extended the deep and surface structure into I language and E language, internal language and external language. And in I language, a speaker is able to create and understand even complex patterns. But in E language, he won't be able to use the learned complex sentences. And it is similar to that of his theory of competence and performance. Actually, the I language is the competence and E language is the performance. An individual may be able to understand the patterns of a large number of sentences. And all these patterns constitute his competence. He may be aware of different kinds of sentences, maybe knowing the patterns, may be able to produce, write, and discuss those complex sentences. But in actual performance, he will not be able to produce such patterns. But he doesn't make use of all these patterns in his speech and writing. And the patterns actually used by the speaker is called his performance. For example, a speaker may be able to use no sooner than, hardly when, or scarcely before in his sentences. While writing, he may be able to use no sooner than, hardly when, or scarcely before. But in actuality, in his communication, when he is asked to deliver a speech, he may not be using such sentences. So these sentences become part of his competence, not part of his performance. And especially we should notice that the people are usually judged by their performance, not by their competence. When a person is asked to attend an interview, so he will be judged for his performance, not by his competence. They don't go to the extent of thinking about the competence of the person. They may only consider what the person has been performing. The performance will be taken into consideration and not the competence. And we should remember these all special things introduced by Noam Chomsky, including his PS grammar, phrase structure grammar, and his theories on the TGG, and after all his deep structure and surface structure, and the LF and PF, the logical form and the phonetic form, and the I language, E language, and his theory of the phrase structure grammar or constituency grammar, and then his theory is connected with the competence and performance. So remember always the points that you will be asked to give answers to a few questions from Noam Chomsky in the UGC exam. Seemingly one of the very important areas in the UGC exam. And thank you for the time being.